powerful decide that holding on to their power and wealth is more important than things like justice or the rights of others, evil things may happen. And the big question then becomes, well, how do we resist? And what do we do when we feel as if we have no power and no voice? That is unfortunately not a new question. It is a question that has come up again and again throughout the history of the world. Now, it is true that we do not have to deal with evil quite on the order of, something where people are tossing an entire generation of an ethnic group into the river in infancy. But just because the evil we have to deal with hasn't risen to the level of active genocide doesn't mean we never have to deal with that question. And if we wait until the point where such a thing has been reached, we may be too late. And so I think it would be very helpful to look at a couple of biblical heroes who dealt with that kind of challenge and won. And when it comes to that, I can hardly think of better examples than the three extraordinary women whose story is told in the book of the Exodus. Now, I know that we often have come to think of the Bible being produced as it was in a very patriarchal society. We've come into the habit of thinking of it as a book that just dismisses women, that suggests that maybe they don't have much, if anything, to contribute. But this story, in the book of Exodus, is a perfect demonstration of how we are wrong to make that kind of assumption. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had a problem, a big problem. But it wasn't actually an unusual problem, and it wasn't a new problem. It was indeed a problem as old as civilization itself. Because ever since its beginning, civilization had had a built-in problem. Civilization, the building and inhabiting of cities, was actually only possible because agriculture had risen to a certain level where societies could actually produce surpluses. Season after season, more food and goods were produced than the workers themselves needed to survive. And civilization was this incredible invention that allowed a small elite to control that surplus and keep it for themselves. And of course, yes, they also provided something in return. They provided security. They took over matters of administration. And they provided religion, which they believed gave meaning to the endless toil of the great mass of the people. And surely the people should be grateful for that. But they weren't. They weren't as grateful as Pharaoh thought they should be. They were restive and rebellious. And the root of the problem was that Pharaoh was aware of one inescapable fact. There was more of them than there was on his side. A lot more. In some ways, it was almost as if Pharaoh was alone against them all. Oh yes, he had priests and retainers and troops. Indeed, he had an entire class of nobles underneath him, but none of them benefited from the system more than he did. The Pharaoh was the 1%, except it was more like the 0.001%. And as soon as the rest of them figured out that simple fact and found a way to work together, Pharaoh was done for. And the problem was that Pharaoh was constantly aware of one aspect of this problem that had been troubling him of late. There was a group that had been put to work constructing various complexes where Pharaoh stored his ever-growing wealth. They were nothing but slaves. But they had begun to form a common identity. They were called Hebrews, and they were united above all in their worship of some strange desert god who was beyond the control of the Egyptian religion that was dominated by Pharaoh. And they were growing in strength and in numbers. And if they realized their strength that they had because of their unity of purpose and of identity, well, they had a potential to bring down the whole system. And Pharaoh had to do something about this. He had already attempted to slow the growth of this group by asserting government control over who could and could not bear children. He did this by ordering the Egyptian midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill all the male Hebrew children at birth. But somehow, Pharaoh was still trying to figure out how the midwives had betrayed him and had allowed the boys to live. They had double-crossed him. And so it appeared he would have to come up with another approach, a much more open approach to the problem. When Jochebed, the wife of Amram, heard the decree, she was horrified. She was horrified at Pharaoh's plan that all the male Hebrew children who were born be cast into the Nile River. She was horrified not only because it was cruel, but because it was a transparent attempt to wipe out the identity of a people. For the Nile River was not just a waterway to the Egyptians. The Nile River was a god. It was a god who, through its annual flooding, gave life to every person who lived along its course. And it seemed as if Pharaoh could not stand the idea that the Nile should grant its blessing to all people, regardless of their station. The Nile watered the fields of the peasants and the gardens of the rich alike. And that was simply unacceptable. And so Pharaoh was determined to transform the life-giving Nile into a ravenous instrument of death. Oh yes, that would teach them all to look to no one but the king to sustain themselves. And in the face of this unmitigated evil, Jochebed came up with a plan. When the decree went out, she was only a few months pregnant. But she already knew, somehow she knew, that it was going to be a boy. And so she immediately laid her plans. By the time she was beginning to show, she withdrew completely from social life. No one must know that a child was on the way. And then once the boy was born, she managed to keep him hidden as long as she could. But by the time he was 3 months old, she knew he could be hidden no longer. And so she made her fateful decision. She would do what Pharaoh had decreed, but it would be malicious compliance. Oh yeah, she would throw the baby into the Nile, all right, but there was a couple of things that she would do first. First of all, she would place the boy in a basket that she wove out of papyrus, a gift of the Nile itself, and plastered with bitumen and pitch. That would turn the river from the ravenous beast that Pharaoh wanted it to be into a cradling womb for the rebirth of her son. And the second thing she would do is she would place her faith and trust in a God who, even if she did not yet know his name, was more powerful than the Nile River or even than Defiant Pharaoh. Even more important, she would do what she did with faith that this God cared for her and her people who had no other protector in the land of Egypt. When the princess caught sight of the basket bobbing along in the river, she knew her day was about to change radically. She knew what people thought of her, that she was nothing more than a princess, nothing more than an adornment on the household of Pharaoh. She was just there to be beautiful and to be quiet. She was supposed to spend her days wallowing in luxury, taking endless baths in the Nile. But she was more than just a pretty face. Oh yes, Pharaoh would have been shocked to learn it, but she understood things. She understood the threat that Pharaoh was trying to counter with his latest decree. But she did have real problems with what he was doing. When the basket was finally brought to the shore and the princess looked inside, she knew without a doubt that this must be a Hebrew boy. She understood, she had heard how desperate Hebrew mothers had grown. What other explanation could there be for a child being in a basket like this? But realizing that, the princess knew she had a choice. On one level, she knew that she was supposed to take the side of her own people and her own class. The Hebrews were outsiders. They were a potential threat to the stability of the system. But she also knew that she was a woman. And as a woman, she was an outsider to power in her own country. And that made her feel as if maybe she might have more in common with the poor woman who in desperation had thrown her son out into the Nile in a basket. But she did not know what she ought to do. Miriam was nothing more than a girl. But that did not mean she didn't know what was going on. Oh, she knew. She knew what the community had been talking about for months. She knew about the terrible thing that had been demanded by the Pharaoh. And for months, she had been a witness to the anguish of her own mother. Miriam had done her part. She had helped to keep the birth of her brother from being noticed. She was often given care for the child when Jochebed and Amram couldn't be around. And she understood how important it was to make sure that nobody outside the house could hear any noise he made. And that was something that had only gotten harder as time went by. And when Miriam had seen her mother leave that morning, carrying the child and weeping, it wasn't hard for her to guess what was going on. And so she followed and observed from a distance. And she saw her mother as she laid the child in the basket and pushed it out into the current. That done, Jochebed had collapsed in despair. She had done what she could. She would have to leave the rest in the hands of the God of her people. But Miriam knew she still had a part to play. She kept her eyes on the basket as it moved at a steady pace through the reeds that lined the shore, as it moved towards the place where the royal party often came down to bathe during the day. And she saw the princess arrived. She saw the excitement and consternation as a basket was discovered, And even from the distance, she could see the confusion and indecision on the face of the princess as she contemplated the child. And that was when Miriam, that poor slave child, that person who had the least possible power and influence in this entire story, did the bravest thing she would ever do. She ran forward. She ran past the guards who protected the princess, and she cried out to her in broken English, "I go." In broken Egyptian, "I go. I go get a nurse. I get Hebrew woman. She nurse baby for you." You see, sometimes when somebody's struggling with a choice, when they know what the right thing is to do but are seized by indecision because they have never dared to be so bold, all they need is a little push. All they need is one small action that they can take towards doing the right thing. Because you see, if they take that one step, the next step is easier, and the next after that as well. And soon they have set themselves on a path towards doing the right thing, doing the thing they truly wanted to do all along. And so Miriam provided the princess with that one simple step. All she needed to do was nod her head yes, and Miriam was off like a shot to find her own mother and present her as a wet nurse for the princess. When powerful people do horrible things to maintain their power and position, the powerless often feel as if there's nothing that they can do. And the truth is that that may be true, especially if they stand alone as individuals. There is little they can do. When the weak stand alone, the powerful only have to pick them off one by one by one. But this story in Exodus tells us of 3 women who were completely powerless. 2 were slaves. 1 was not even an adult. 1 was nothing more than an ornament for the Pharaoh's household. They did not conspire together, but somehow they found a way to act together. They acted in faith, and above all, they acted in solidarity. They might have not had any reason at all to find that solidarity. The princess, in particular, had no reason to find kinship with the Hebrew slave. The Hebrew women had nothing in common with the princess. But by choosing solidarity and faith, each one of them played a key role to put the pieces in place that would disrupt Pharaoh's evil plans. Now, if only we could find such courage, if only we could embrace such solidarity. Lord our God, when evil is abroad, teach us to stand together.